Good afternoon. This is Bob Celeste, and welcome to Open Mic Friday, where we have weekly discussions with interesting people doing interesting things. Support for today's program comes from CryptoWorks. To learn how the CryptoWorks seal can safeguard your supply chains by anchoring your vital data in blockchains, visit CryptoWorks at www.cryptowork.com. For those of you who are in our live broadcast, all lines are currently muted just to minimize background noise. However, if you'd like to speak to our guests and have a conversation, please use the raise your hand icon and I'll open up your line so you can talk to Brenan. Or you can type a question in the chat area and I'll make my best attempt to channel your question with Brenan. So speaking of our guest today, we have Brenan Isabelle as a North American Sales Director for Nodalblock, a Madrid-based software developer providing a blockchain as a service platform for enterprise and government clients. Before that, Brenan was Director of Business Development at a private debt fund and Strategy and Operations Consultant at Deloitte. Today, as we've seen, blockchain officially entered sort of the Trough of Disillusionment on this summer for the Gartner's Hype Cycle, making headlines around the world, and yet almost no mention was made of the blockchain for data security that appears on that same scale. Brenan joins us today to speak with us about blockchain's potential as a disruptive cybersecurity technology and how it will reshape the ways we interact with the digital world. Brenan, welcome to the show today.
Hi, Bob. Thank you very much for having me on. It's my pleasure.
Great. Brenan, maybe you could give us a little bit of background on yourself and Nodalblock.
Yeah, happy to do that. So thanks for your introduction on me. That's probably my whole life story. I had kind of an untraditional route into where I am today. I came out of university back in 2007, and I was a little bit disappointed with what I was seeing in the day-to-day jobs. So I basically left Canada and drove to California and became a skydiving instructor for a number of years before I went back and did my MBA. So nice. I came into all this stuff with I guess an appreciation for everything you can do in life, and I've always viewed my career as a bit of an adventure. So there's certainly lots of adventure these days in enterprise blockchain.
Well, they say that normally people are going to have about 12 different careers in their lifetime now. So you have 9 or 10 more left.
Yes, yes. So yeah, thanks for bringing up the Gartner Hype Cycle. I wanted to talk about that. So.
Do you want me to bring that up just so people can have a look at it?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. So just in terms of who Nodalblock is, we're Spain's largest enterprise blockchain startup. We have about 15 people in Spain and 3 here in Canada. I like to say we're a leader in blockchain cybersecurity and identity management, and we're working with some of Europe's largest insurers. Bankia, which is a Spanish bank with about 200 billion in assets. We also work with KPMG Spain and one of Europe's top sports teams, which is yet to be announced. So, yeah, I'm teasing that one a little bit. Okay. So blockchain for data security. Gartner has it at the innovation trigger stage here in the hype cycle, and I did remark on it like you did that it made the news that blockchain had officially entered the Trough of Disillusionment. Yet blockchain for data security is a little bit earlier on here and doesn't seem to get quite the same coverage now. That is changing a little bit, and I think we'll see it continue to change as some of the projects in this area become full production and a little bit better known. But being a practitioner, I certainly take note when something is announced, and there are lots of announcements to follow in this area.
So being in the trough is not necessarily a bad thing. Sometimes I look at that as that's good. We may be coming, it's winter now, but spring is coming. But you're going to talk today.
Everything has to go through the trough.
Yeah, I guess so. So you want to talk a little bit about cybersecurity and digital identity. Maybe you can go through a little bit on what kind of problems we're solving with those items, and where maybe the opportunity is.
Yeah, so I'm going to go back to Gartner here. I'm going to quote Gartner directly. So when Gartner talks about blockchain for cybersecurity, they're talking about ensuring trust between community participants, integrity, trust, and immutability, resiliency and of networks, I assume they mean, and availability of data. And then, of course, there's numerous use cases we can point to. For instance, you mentioned in the supply chain, a number of large aerospace companies and U.S. defense contractors are using blockchain prototypes in their supply chain for data assurance. I also noted recently that the Cook County Recorder of Deeds, I believe in December, announced paperless record certification using blockchain. So, for instance, if I need to share a copy of my my deed to my house to get a mortgage or something like that, today generally you have to have a copy of that on paper, and maybe multiple copies cost money. There's potential for fraud. With a secure watermarked document, typically that has a QR code linking to a transparency portal, you can have that document shared electronically, which streamlines processes for things like real estate financing or deed transfer, which is another area that I used to work in. So I'm very familiar with the pain points of mortgage financing.
That's interesting that's actually coming to fruition. It's been one of those use cases that people have touted that have possibilities. It's interesting to hear that someone's actually doing it and using it.
Yeah, that's one of the services we provide through our API, is also to certify any type of digital file, and Nodalblock would have a transparency portal that would be linked with the QR code, and anybody can visit that and verify by dropping in the original image file or PDF file that it is actually the original and hasn't been tampered with. And the way that happens is you essentially take the hash or cryptographic fingerprint of that file when it's created or certified, and you record that file's hash or cryptographic fingerprint on the blockchain, and that allows you to verify it at a later time.
Interesting. So in some aspects, it's used for managing digital assets, but can you talk a little bit about the things you're involved with in linking the digital world to the real world and some of the challenges that you see there?
Yeah, absolutely. So, one of the areas we work in is with security printers who produce things like passports, bank checks, security labels for things like packages. And so, by linking those security labels to a tamper-proof blockchain, we can do things like, have an end consumer accessing data about a product. Like, for instance, if we're talking about a food product, it could be nutritional information, it could be manufacturer, and of course, there's the famous example of Walmart and the lettuce food trust network and so on. And that's a good example. Another thing that we do is linking photos to the blockchain. So we've developed Nodalpick, which is our app that in real time certifies the user of the app, the photo content, the timestamp, and the geolocation on our blockchain, allowing you to create trusted photos. So perhaps that would be a photo of a package that's been delivered and left on someone's doorstep, or a car accident, or property damage after a storm, for instance.
That's interesting. So maybe you could go into a little bit more on that. So does that link to, I guess I heard two things. One might be digital identity and linking to documents or photos that you have of yourself, and then the other one being situational, where you may be showing, to your point, an accident or something like that, and being able to link that photo to the time and date and where you're at.
Yeah, so it combines a couple of different functions of blockchain: a digital identity that identifies the user, and then also the certification function. So this is an area where you see a lot of mentions of fake news, especially spreading over social networks. So I think a famous example was the pictures from a few months ago that were supposedly taken at a detention center at the southern border, and actually were not from the place and time that was reported. So you've got an issue where it's difficult to discern what, first of all, is this photo from the place that we're being told it was, or the time, who took it, but also it's very difficult to know whether that photo has been tampered with by something like artificial intelligence, so or even generated completely by artificial intelligence. So there's a real problem of trust in the digital world, and that's one of the areas where blockchain may be able to be part of the bigger solution, not the whole solution, but part of the bigger solution.
So you're in that case, you'd be hashing the photo data in order to prove whether
so the photo's content.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly, the photo's content. So the image is hashed, but also the phone's geolocation data, and we combine that with the digital ID that we've created for identifying individuals or businesses.
Okay, well, that should be interesting for the photography industry also, where there's a lot of concern with people just lifting someone else's intellectual property, if you will, and using it.
Yes, that's a big problem. Rights holders have trouble, and of course, this is another area where Kodak, for instance, has released Kodak One and Kodak Coin for that, solving that exact problem, rights attribution for photos. And I was reading an article about a famous race car driver today that has joined their platform. So it's good to see that there's some progress being made there.
Really, and they're actually making headway with that. I know that they put a ICO out, right?
Yeah, so I don't know that Kodak actually did an ICO, but I'm not totally sure what happened there. I'm not an expert in ICOs. We generally don't dabble in crypto at all, so
Okay.
Yeah, I may not be the expert on that.
So in terms of digital identity and data security, how does this, how can you give us sort of an idea of how you kind of see things playing out from a, let's say, even a patient perspective of being able to control their data that someone else might be holding? So the data might be in other either databases or systems, but it really is the patient's data.
Yeah, so I guess we're talking about the environment here of data and digital identity, which is probably one of the thorniest problems facing technology today, as our relationships with government and with each other and with businesses are just increasingly online, and we're seeing data breach after data breach, and particularly the last 3 years, just it seems to have gotten bigger and bigger. So blockchain can do a couple of interesting things in terms of putting users back in control. If we're talking about patient data, probably one of the more interesting things I think that blockchain can do is to track consent in a way that's third-party verifiable, and cryptographically secure. So what do I mean by that? So so when you're in a heavily regulated industry like insurance or financial services or healthcare, things like consent become very important. And if you're operating in Europe, where GDPR is in effect, basically any company that collects data on its customers has issues around consent and data privacy now, with very severe penalties, by the way. I think something like 2% of gross revenue maximum penalty for violations. So that's a very serious problem. Maybe just to unpack this a little bit, we can talk about first about the different types of identity. So I would say there's broadly three different types of digital identity. There's siloed identities, federated identities, and self-sovereign identity. So to start with siloed, this is basically what we deal with every day. So I want to do business with a company, or even I have a relationship. If we go back to healthcare, I guess for a minute, I may have an online login for my doctor's office or medical records. So when I enroll, I'm given a username and password, choose a username and password, and then perhaps some additional security features like secrets that only I know. And of course, those may or may not, in the world of social media, those secrets may not be so secret at all. A PIN, and perhaps some other security features. So the issue with siloed identities, we end up with separate credentials for each relationship, and it's really one way. So the company or the other party can authenticate me, but it's more difficult for me to authenticate them, and it leaves me open to things like phishing scams that impersonate one of my relationships, or obtain my password and then go to that company and impersonate me. Next, I would say we have the federated identity model, which also you might know as single sign-on, or identity as a service, or social sign-on. It's all sort of part of the same federated model. So things like sign up with your Google, or sign up with Facebook, sign in with Facebook, enterprise single sign-ons. It's all a little bit easier to use, and it's a step in the right direction, but you've got added complexity because there's a third party in the middle between you and your supplier, or your customer, or the people that you want to do business with. And ultimately, it doesn't really prevent phishing attacks either.
And
Finally,
doesn't it kind of leak a little bit of your information?
Yes, it very well might. Yes. So and ultimately, you're going to have to sign up with multiple. I may have a single sign-on at work that allows me to sign on to my Microsoft 365 and my Salesforce, but then when I go home, I've got various other relationships that I have to remember lots of different credentials for. So it's not perfect. Okay. Finally, we've got self-sovereign identity. So this is where blockchain really comes into its own. It's essentially a peer-to-peer model, and it relies on a user having control of their own personal data, their own personal identifying information in a digital wallet, and that data is then verified by a third party, like say a bank or a government, that knows me and can vouch for my data being accurate. So there's various projects in the both in the enterprise blockchain world and in the crypto world that fall into this category, and I guess we can unpack it a little bit more later on.
So that's interesting, the different kinds of identities. And one of the things that you mentioned that was kind of interesting also is not only authenticating yourself, but the company that you're trying to interact with. And I just say that because I must get at least 5 calls a week from fake Microsoft that wants to help me out with my computer. And about a month ago, I got a real call from Microsoft, and boy, did I put them through the ringer, because I didn't know who they were, and they had no way of proving who they were, really. And so it got to be a very frustrating thing. So, all of this business here is hurting not only the consumer or the person that's trying to reach out, but also companies that are trying to interact with their customers.
Yes, absolutely. So this is certainly an area where I think self-sovereign identity offers probably the only solution to this problem. So I think maybe we should look at where where this has been used, or where it's closest to being used. A couple of the the new projects are, for instance, Hyperledger Indy, and the DID, or decentralized identity, which is basically an open source set of rules where someone who is participating has a personal wallet, and then the cryptographic representation of their data, so the evidence of their data, their personal data, goes on the blockchain, and then is kind of signed by another party who is vouching for them, if you will, or in blockchain speak, attesting to their data being accurate.
Okay. And you said before that could be, I mean, just like we do in real life paper, it could be a bank, it could be the government.
Exactly, yeah. So
someone we do business with.
There's a few EID or electronic ID programs that are either in production, like for instance, EID in Estonia has been cited very widely as a very successful implementation. There's others that haven't been quite as successful, like Aadhaar in India seems to have some issues. Another one that I'd like to sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, just last week we heard about apparently the Mongolian government has an ID for each patient, and that's very helpful in I guess them attesting to the patient and the patient receiving services because of that. So there's another example.
Yeah, absolutely. So the question is, does that EID function for all government services, or is it strictly healthcare? So in the Estonian example, they have a single EID, which I think some outrageous percentage, like 97% of people use it, and I think something like 60% of people use it every week. So it's incredibly prolific in their public services, which is pretty impressive. I haven't read about any major breaches, and it came out of a massive cybersecurity breach that happened, I think, in the 90s, and they wanted to redesign their entire stack, and that's what they did. So I'm not sure if it's true blockchain, but some aspects of it are.
So how would that work in sort of if you could walk us through sort of a day-to-day usage of it? You're talking about the wallets, and I imagine that could be either accessed or placed on a cell phone or another device.
Yes, exactly. So at some point, you have some kind of secure token, and I don't mean token like a security token or an ICO related thing. I mean like an actual file that is stored securely, say on your smartphone, for instance. And when Nodalblock implements this type of software, what we do is we either store it on the device, or we store it in a company's backend systems, depending on the use case, or perhaps we manage them. But ultimately, you've got a file that's generated from personal identifying information. So, for instance, to enroll, I might put in my name and my date of birth, for instance, and then that would be cryptographically secured, perhaps with biometrics too. And so, when I put my thumbprint on my phone or my face, for instance, it might unlock that secure wallet and allow me to present my token or credential, or whatever you want to call it, for verification to some other party. And in that way, I can prove that I am me if the other parties have a record that is authenticated or attested to.
So would there be layers of this? In other words, if two companies are trying to interact together, not only identifying the companies, but also the employee that may be initiating the transaction?
Yeah, exactly. So ultimately, for this to be useful, it has to improve on the status quo system, right? So the status quo, unfortunately, is is a real smorgasbord of paper trail and trail through different systems like email, like customer relationship management. And if you try and answer basic questions about what exactly happened, those questions are much more complicated than you might think, because you have to look through audit trails from multiple different systems, like, for instance, your identity and access management system, your security information event management software. And these are generally provided by different vendors and have different technologies involved. And you may have many different IDs for a single employee or customer across business lines. We've seen even in a single company, upwards of 10 or 12 different or even more different identifying numbers for a single customer, which leads to having to repeat things like know your customer processes. And it's a problem. So, what we do is we provide an API that essentially allows you to create digital IDs for your customers, for your employees, and we manage all the blockchain backend systems that allows you to plug that into your identity and access management system, and it creates a new form of multi-factor authentication. So instead of just having to enter a username and password, for example, I need to present this cryptographically created token that's unique to me, which is then checked against the blockchain, which, in theory anyway, is tamper-proof. So, and then of course you can layer on something like biometrics to make the user experience a little bit easier to navigate.
Okay, and these are in your experience and how you've been setting these up, these are permission blockchains that are being used?
Yeah, we do use permission blockchains, or maybe even fully private blockchains. So it's rare that you want to use a public network like Ethereum. We use a private implementation of Ethereum. The nodes are hosted in the cloud around the world at many different locations. And so it's very difficult to tamper with that type of system, because to have a successful cyber attack, you have to attack all the nodes simultaneously, which is just extremely difficult. And if one of the nodes is successfully attacked, it's going to be a self-healing system that gets more secure as it gets larger. So if there is an attack on the information in one node, the system as a whole should reject those changes. So that's very different from cybersecurity software in general, because if you look at something like an identity and access management system, you might have different components of that. So there's an authentication component, there's an authorization component, which would include things like role-based access control. There's user management, so there's onboarding, offboarding of users, and a central user repository just at a high level. So one issue is if your central user repository, or essentially where people keep all their usernames and passwords, is attacked, one, that just creates a huge vulnerability, and two, there may not be a reliable record of what actually happened, because the first thing an attacker is going to do, if they can, is delete the intrusion record in your system. So enterprise today is very reliant on these centralized systems for IAM, and blockchain could be an area that can improve those, particularly in the audit trail.
Interesting. Can you tell, are there any applications or that you've developed that you can actually kind of walk us through or talk about? I know that we're not asking you to reveal any IP, but just how that might work and the kind of things that you've worked with.
Yeah, so we focus on 4 core products: the digital ID, data certification, digital signature, and encrypted data sharing. So just to give you a couple of examples, with our digital identity product, we can onboard a customer, for instance. So we built it with banks and insurers in mind. So, the first step is to enter some personal information. Generally, we're going to have a user photograph their identity card, so driver's license or passport. And then there's a check using facial recognition that enrolls the user so that they can return and log in again to the system. And it also checks their identity document to make sure that the person who's behind the computer's face matches the identity document. And so, that is not, I mean, we're not the only provider out there that does that, but I think we're one of the first to combine it with a blockchain digital ID and a blockchain digital signature, and being able to have tamper-proof contract management and all that in a single solution. So that's our differentiator. A couple of other things that we built that are kind of interesting. I think I mentioned Nodalblock before. Won't go over that one again, but another thing that we're doing is in ticketing, and ticketing is a very interesting area where there's a massive amount of issues around the reseller marketplaces. You see in the news, the StubHubs of the world, the Ticketmasters of the world. There's a major problem with the resale of tickets. So how is that ticket supply chain operating today, and how could it be improved, and how can we put more control into the rights holders' hands, so the people who actually